Good evening, everyone. I'm Sean McQueen, President and CEO of Global Santa Fe. We're delighted to host with the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and WorldNow tonight's book talk with Professor Frank Trentmann. To have Trentmann here with us is fortuitous, as this is an especially critical time to take a deep dive into Germany's history as it faces internal and external challenges, all of which have wide ramifications for Europe and the transatlantic partnership. Let me also take this opportunity to recognize and thank our partners who have promoted this program to their members. They are shown on the credit slide. I want to especially express our appreciation to the American Council on Germany, whose president, Steve Sokol, was president of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh from 2010 to 2015. Our next program will be on May 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern, when we welcome science journalist Sarah Schulz talking about her new book, Countdown: The Blinding Future of Nuclear Weapons. Recently, she spoke to a standing room audience in Santa Fe, which led us to want to bring her here to our audiences. Let's now welcome Dr. Frank Trentmann, who is joining us from the University of Chicago, where he is this term a visiting scholar. He is a professor of history at the University of London and the University of Helsinki. Previously, he taught at Princeton. As reviewers of his book have noted, that he grew up in Hamburg and now lives in London with many years studying abroad, gives him a unique advantage point to write and speak about Germany as an insider and an outside observer. Joining Frank tonight is my friend and colleague, Jim Falk. Jim is Vice Chairman of Global Santa Fe and President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. He hosts Perspectives Matter on KERA in Dallas and is a host of our World Now series. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks so much, Sean. Frank, great to see you. And people were saying, you are really staying up late since you're a professor usually in London or Helsinki, but where are you tonight? We made it a little bit easier.
I'm in what's called South Loop in Chicago. I have the good fortune and privilege to be a Schaffner visiting professor at the University of Chicago in their spring quarter.
Well, I bet you're enjoying that. Well, when your publisher at Knopf sent me the press release, I knew I wanted to learn more about this period of history. And even though the book weighs a fair amount and is over 600 pages, I mentioned that because I want our viewers to know that we are just going to be able to scratch the surface, because you did such a remarkable job of really tracing several decades. And that leads me really to my first question is, how did you come upon the dates of 1942 to 2022? Because it would strike me that you might have started earlier with, say, the battle, really probably in 1934, 35.
Well, the end date is simple because I stopped writing the book in January 2023, which is important because that was the point when the German Chancellor finally swung around and offered support to send weapons to Ukraine. The starting point is more interesting. You might think would have been natural to start in 1945, what people call hour zero. But as I was starting to research the book, in the archives, so in letters, correspondence, but as well as official documentation, it very quickly became clear that 1945 is not the sharp break that you might think. And that something's happening in the winter of 1942, 1943, beginning with a defeat at Stalingrad, and then the ever more relentless aerial bombing. And what's happening there, not across the whole population, but in segments of the population, is that for the first time since the beginning of the war, people start asking themselves very uncomfortable questions. What is this war about? Why are hundreds of thousands of our sons being sacrificed? There must be a reason why we're being bombed. So 42, 43 is sort of an ideal moment really to go into that complicated history and to explore how people at the time had their moral certainties rattled and the consequences they drew, which are contradictory.
And when we just showed the map, and you tend to forget just how much territory Germany had captured and had under occupation. You talk about really the Battle of Stalingrad as also being a key point. And before you reply to that, let me just remind our viewers that go ahead and put questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat if possible, but in the Q&A. And rather than wait to the end, I like to weave the questions into the conversation. So just go ahead and start putting them in. But tell us, Frank, about how that battle of Stalingrad really, as you said, changed the perspective of how people looked at the war.
Yeah, let me give you one example, which is a school teacher in northern Germany whose son has been fighting in the Second World War, and he's moved to the east. And so the father knows, his son is being moved closer and closer to Stalingrad. And then in December 1942, correspondence stops, and then come the ever more dismal messages in January, and then the announcement in February that the whole army has been lost. So this man was enthusiastic in supporting the war into 1941-42. As Germany conquered more and more territory, as you just showed on the map, this man is writing letters praising Hitler as the greatest statesman people ever had. When former pupils come back from the East and make references to atrocities, he just sort of brushes them aside. But then his son is being lost in Stalingrad, and the family doesn't know. Is he alive? Is he dead? Is he captured? Should we hope he's captured, or perhaps rather hope that he's dead? And he keeps a very detailed diary. And so in February and March, he starts in his diary suddenly being critical of Hitler and asking himself, who's the worst perpetrator here? Stalin, as we are told, or perhaps Hitler after all? He then stops hoisting the swastika flag. He says, I'm not going to put out a flag any longer till my son is back. He puts off his party badge, and he stops writing reports for the security service on what fellow teachers and neighbors have been saying in town. And so by 1944, the same man who started being enthusiastic about the war had convinced himself that he's always been skeptical, that he's always been worried about these atrocities, that the more he hears about atrocities, the more he's worried what the Russians might do to his son. So you can see in a man like that how the defeat in Stalingrad just suddenly raised questions about, is this a just war? Can Germany win the war? If Germany can't win the war, what might happen to the fatherland? So that's the kind of story. Might be the moment to read a little bit from a few lines. If you,
I wish you would, please.
Yeah, if you agree. So one great thing about the Germans, and hence the German archives, is that, as you know, Germans are very meticulous. So the records we have on what people said, thought, and felt are absolutely extraordinary. And one thing the Nazis have is an extensive intelligence network where they keep tab on what people in localities say. And so I'm just going to read a few lines from what's being reported at the local level and captured in intelligence reports beginning in early 1943. So in Halle, opinion was split in 1943 between those who wanted to kill all the Jews and those who said if the Germans had not attacked the Jews in the first place, they would already be enjoying peace. The shock of Stalingrad has still not faded away. The district president of Swabia, observed in June 1943. And locals were now expressing fear that Russians might kill German POWs, quote, in revenge for German mass executions of Jews in the East. By November 1944, the security branch in Stuttgart criticized Nazi propaganda about the Red Army massacre of German civilians in East Prussia because it so easily backfired. Numerous voices in the population were saying, every thinking person who sees this blood sacrifice will immediately think of the atrocities that we have committed in enemy lands. Indeed, even in Germany itself, have we not slaughtered the Jews in their thousands? Do soldiers not report again and again that Jews in Poland had to dig their own graves? And what we have done to the Jews in Alsace, in the concentration camp? Jews are human too. Thus, we have shown the enemies how they can treat us if they win. Now, that was a lot of we's, and there was this sense of complicity for crimes committed in their name, which was gaining ground in the second half of the war.
So when you look at the number of deaths from the war, well, the number that always comes to my mind is the 6 million Jews who were killed. How many Germans were killed? And, you know, I'm going to ask Abby, who does such a wonderful job with the photos, to pull up the picture of Stalingrad. But how many Germans were killed during the war, and how many were killed in particular at this battle?
Well, in Stalingrad, I mean, ultimately 100,000 are captured. And of those, only, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 would return to Germany. That's partly because they'd been fighting in such miserable conditions, had already had various diseases, and they were not, you know, they were not exterminated in that sense by the Russians. I think what's the really important number is that virtually all losses of German soldiers happen in the last year of the war, year and a half of the war. So basically starting of Stalingrad, and then comes Kursk, which has over 130,000 victims. So you see a massive gathering of dead people. You can add, of course, the people killed in aerial bombing. That shoots up, though not as high as people sometimes think. But nonetheless, you have massive displacement. And then you have, at the very end of the war, you have 12 million refugees. And the number of how many people died in the forced expulsions is contested, but it's probably another just over 1 million. Of those. So you have massive carnage all around. I think one important thing to stress about the 6 million killed in what we now call the Holocaust or the Shoah is that 6 million includes almost 2 million who were killed by the bullet. So not killed in gas extermination camps, but literally lined up and being killed with a bullet to the head. So one thing I think we need to grasp is that the atrocities I just referred to do not refer to distant anonymous mass killing. I mean, these are stories that come back to Germany about atrocities performed by the SS, but also with the regular army being complicit and involved.
So our viewers will quickly realize that I never studied German, so my apologies, and please correct me. But as late as 2015, the German president, Gauck, said there is no German identity without Auschwitz. I'm wondering, as the generation of people who experienced the war shrinks, is this less the case? And when we think about Germany coming to grips with the Holocaust, how is that changing now with the younger generation? And soon we'll talk about Gaza and Israel, which I know sort of is a new factor, but try to sort of weave a way around this.
Yeah, yeah. So the statement you read, the famous quote by the German president, comes really after decades of a tug of war between different groups in society. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you have as many people who are trying to hold on to the idea that this was a good war, which just went wrong, or it was a just war that just Hitler and Himmler diverted into crimes against humanity. And then on the other hand, a growing number of voices saying, no, Germans must take responsibility. This was a collective war of extermination. And so it took a long time for that to get recognized and to become the official position. And so I think one should note that positive point. I think what we've seen, particularly in the last half year, is how shaky that memory politics is. So while this is clearly an officially recognized position, you nonetheless have anti-Semitism, which persists, and you have challenges to the centrality or the singularity of the Holocaust. And they come from different directions. They come both from the extreme right, but they also come from certain left quarters that want to insert the Holocaust into a much longer history as just one chapter in Western oppression. Your question about the difference generational change makes is important, I think, on two levels. One is children of people, families who've lived in Germany forever or for a very long time. So if people growing up now, so teenagers, they will not have anyone in their family who's been likely to have been actively involved in the war. So we're talking really about stories about their great-grandparents or their great-great-grandparents. And that makes a difference. So these stories are history rather than immediate politics and memory. And for many people in the younger generation, say colonial struggles or climate change are much more important. And so the memory politics has lost a little bit of touch with that younger generation because it hasn't really done much to explain the relevance and immediate relevance of the Second World War and the Holocaust for today's problems. And then the second level is to remember that we're dealing with a migrant society. So we have several million people in Germany who do not have any family relations to people who fought in the Second World War on the German side. They come from Turkey in the 1960s and 70s, or Italy, or Portugal, or more recently, Lebanon and Syria. And for them, this they're often put in the position of being a passive audience that's expected to listen to this memory politics and act accordingly. So it can be a little bit patronizing, if you want, to them. And one has to remember some members in that group are themselves refugees or have themselves been victims of war crimes. So this is a growing challenge for memory politics. And I think Germans had become a little bit complacent because you have all these monuments, you have memorial sites, schools go regularly and visit concentration camps. And the idea was that just remembering will automatically produce values and action. And I think that was naive.
And I think we have a picture of one of the memorials. And even though Birgit Kovacs put the question in the chat box, I'll go ahead and do it. Has there been a change in the curriculum in the German education system on these issues from, she says, from the 80s to now?
Well, that's a very good question, and I can answer that with a personal memory. So I was born in 1965, so I completed high school in the early 80s, and I did the equivalent of A levels in history. Our modern history curriculum. This is in a politically progressive area, Hamburg, social democratic. Lots of memorial politics, but at school level, our history ended with 1933. There was no, and I remember, so I must have been 15 perhaps, a famous documentary of the camps from the mid 1950s, Night and Fog. We had to ask our parents for special permission to be able to see that documentary. So that's how far behind we were. Since then, the Second World War and the Holocaust are a central part of the school curriculum. But I think the problem we've had, it's become such a routinized way of teaching that history, that it's become divorced from the history before and the history after. So just to give one example, Germany also committed a colonial genocide in what is now Namibia.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that from school books. So it's understandable that at the local level, when people want to rename streets or talk about changing monuments, they're incensed that there is attention to the Holocaust, but what about other crimes against humanity? So there's a little bit of lack of context.
Well, let me ask you about this, because it's what we're seeing in the United States at this time. And again, I apologize if I don't say this word correctly, but Schatzraison, which means raison d'etat, the commitment of Germany to, perhaps it almost sounds like the strategic ambiguity the United States has had with Taiwan, that Germany would come to the defense of Israel. Talk about that, if I'm on the right track, and then how that now is playing out with the war in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, the Staatsräson is the official policy and also the official term in public rhetoric that refers to Germany's commitment to defend the state of Israel and to support the state of Israel. And it was coined by Angela Merkel when she was chancellor. But the roots of it go back to the immediate post-war years, to the Adenauer years, to 1952, when Adenauer signed a agreement to pay reparations and compensation to Israel and the Jewish Claims Conference. It's very, very important. And it was the state of what was then West Germany, that took on itself to pay these reparations. That's very important. This was hotly contested in society and also among the political parties. So Adenauer was only able to do this with the support of the opposition Social Democrats. Some Germans felt, yeah, well, we did wrong. We should probably do some rehabilitation. But most people did not think that the German state should pay such large amounts of money. So the state was always the state, not German society, which stood side by side with Israel. So Merkel reiterated that. But between the 1950s and the 2010s, when Merkel said this, lots of things changed. And two big changes are human rights, which are universal. And the second is that you have repeated initiatives in Germany by social groups, church groups, young education initiatives to teach compassion for the poor and suffering people in different parts of the world. And so what you now have is you have a real tension and contradiction between public policy, which says we can't criticize Israel, we must support Israel on the one hand, and on the other, a kind of politics of compassion, which says, what about the poor people in Gaza? Who's standing up for the poor people of Gaza? And that's really the conflict right now. And you see these rival poles of the Staatsräson on the one hand, and universal compassion and human rights on the other, going straight through German foreign policy.
And you see that Germany is the second largest seller of arms to Israel, behind the United States. And then there's the other side. I saw this morning that Germany is no longer providing funds to the United Nations Refugee Relief Agency, but then now is giving funds for Syria, Jordan, and the West Bank, but not for Gaza. So it's very complex. There's a question here. Let me see. There it is. One of the things that I thought that you did so well in the book was really explaining the sharp divisions in philosophy and culture between formerly West Germany and East Germany. And John Agosny from the Connecticut World Affairs Council says, to what degree and in what ways did the split of East and West Germany generate different narratives of the war?
Oh, huge, huge difference. Very good question. And it explains a lot, in fact, not just what happened in the when Germany was divided, but it casts a shadow all the way to the present. The West German attitude, as I just said about Adenauer, was that West Germany was a little bit like an honorable son who took on the debt of his father. So West Germany sees itself in the constitution as a continuation of the German Empire. And it thus also took on the responsibility for what had happened during the Second World War and the debts arising from it. So you have a story of continuity and moral rehabilitation. The East German story is that East Germany is socialist and was always the victim of fascism, and in fact helped to overthrow fascism. So the GDR did not owe anyone anything except the Soviet Union. So East Germany does not make any reparation payments. In fact, East Germany doesn't even return the property stolen from Jews, with the simple argument that while Jews were capitalists, we now have socialism. We're not stupid in giving property back to profit-hungry Jewish capitalists. So East Germany really washed its hands of any complicity in the Second World War. What East Germany did was use a tougher line against war criminals, particularly in important positions like in the justice system. East Germany clears out anyone who was a Nazi party member or served as a judge or attorney. So you have a complete overhaul of the justice system, and they remove implicated people from powerful positions in the economy. Where people are not really important to the building of socialism, so think school teachers, doctors, policemen, Nazis also stay in power in East Germany. But why this is important is that East Germany developed a rather uncomplicated view that ultimately it had nothing to do with the Second World War, and also not with the atrocities committed. Those were the bad ones, the fascists who are now in West Germany. That's a rather biased way of doing it. And it also left behind, and we can see it now in the split opinion about what to do with Ukraine. You have a much more sympathetic view towards Russia in what is the states of the former GDR now. many people don't have a problem with a strong ruler in East Germany. And there's fear that, East Germans were stationed, Soviet troops were stationed in East Germany, that they might come back if you lend too much support to Ukraine.
Well, let's go back, before we talk about Ukraine, let's go back 30 plus years to the reunification. I really got the sense from reading your book that we were really lucky. The world was lucky. It could have gone another way. It could have been very ugly. And there really were just some fortuitous circumstances that made it so that it was relatively peaceful. And I wonder if you might touch on that.
Yeah, it's important to put this a little bit in global context. I mean, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had Tiananmen Square.
Right. What was it, 3 weeks before or something?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So the obvious question is, why did East German rulers not consider the Chinese option, as it was called? The then leadership congratulated Chinese government on their suppression of the protesters in Tiananmen Square. But as we know, this didn't happen. And there's several reasons. One is the crisis in the regime itself. So most people in power, like Honecker, are now very old. Honecker had several surgeries, had cancer in the gallbladder, and then ultimately also prostate and many other things, and was, very, very, very ill, and returned from surgery really a shadow of his former self. Meanwhile, the man who would become his successor, Krenz, is trying to oust Honecker. So when the masses start to demonstrate and go on their protest marches in Leipzig, the troops are out, but the troops are waiting for a signal from Berlin. What do you want us to do? The troops are not happy to come down hard. And here it's important to remember, this is East Germany, not China. So most people in the army troops and the police regiments had no fighting experience whatsoever. And the officers were also, they were worried because they thought, well, my people have never even wielded the truncheon. I mean, how is this going to turn out? Most of the people walking and marching in the street are neighbors. So there's real inhibition to using of force. And then the signal doesn't come from Berlin because Krenz is deliberating. Now, what is he going to do? If it's going to be a bloodbath, actually, that might not be ideal for him wanting to take over. So the moment passes and there hasn't been a confrontation, and that really encourages now ever greater demonstrations. That's the sort of political nitty-gritty. It's also, I think, important that the heads of the state intelligence make it absolutely clear that there will be no tanks going after people. And the Russians, by that time, Gorbachev had made it clear, look, this is not going to be like in 1953, where you had a popular uprising and it was Russian tanks which suppressed it. And Gorbachev made clear that if there's trouble, you're on your own now. We're not going to help you out. So it was a fortuitous series of circumstances that helped it be a peaceful revolution.
You tell the anecdote about Margaret Thatcher carrying in her handbag a map of, what was it, 1937, because she was not, at least in the beginning, for the unification, was she?
No. No, she was not. I mean, in her back, so this map in her handbag was to point out to people, have you forgotten? This is what Germany wants. It will not stop with East Germany. It will want greater borders, and then you will have the Anschluss and then further eastern expansion. But Thatcher was on her own. So that, I think that's important. Mitterrand was willing to strike a deal. The United States was openly in support. And the real tipping point then was that that winter of 89-90, because initially it's also not clear how the West German population will react. And so Chancellor Kohl then is sort of, for a few weeks, he's really deliberating. He often gets booed. One forgets that, you know, he was booed when he talked about now East Germans will also be free. It's not clear where this is going. Will this be two separate German states or reunification? And it's ultimately Kohl who, at one night after having an enthusiastic reception in Dresden, just decides this is it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. And then without consulting the Western allies or Gorbachev, he comes up with a 10-point plan, which puts the train on track towards reunification. So that was a daring move.
So let me ask you this, because, you know, when I think back to those heady days, people are happy, they're climbing over or walking through to formerly West Germany. But it was really hard for some people. And in your book, you have a paragraph or two by a woman who I believe I remember right was an engineer, and just how her life changed so precipitously. And I wonder if I might ask you to read that paragraph.
Yeah, no, one great thing we have, and which I try to utilize as much as possible in my book, is we have from those months in 1989 and 1990, we have a series of extensive diaries which people started keeping to record and which record their changing emotional state.
Well, you have several in the book, and this one that I'd like you to read is really
so this woman is called Katya K, and she was 36 years old in 1990 when her country disappeared. She was a single mother, professional, trained engineer, started developing computer chips in 1987, so kind of the model citizen that you can have. But as you know, those chips that the GDR produced didn't really stand much chance in the world market. So like many, many others, within months after the fall of after reunification, she's informed that there would be job cuts. And so in September 1990, she's sitting at the unemployment office and writes in her diary the new reality. And she complains how the very forms she had to fill in were based on a West German lifestyle. So she was asked whether she had attended a gymnasium, a selective type of school that only existed in West Germany, didn't even exist in East Germany. Then she was asked whether she had studied abroad, also not so easy if you lived behind the wall. I see no reason to hide my education. I'm proud of it. Why do they refuse to recognize that? It makes me want to throw up. In the few months, the joy of November and feeling of community and confidence had given way to a sense of anger and powerlessness. For her, 1990, the year of reunification, was a nosedive that ended with the haggling for our souls. October the 2nd, the last day of the GDR, was, she writes, one of the blackest days of my life. I felt like a convict awaiting execution, expelled, a stranger in my own country, unspeakably sad, no work, no love, no Heimat, homeland, no happiness. Just before midnight, she put on the national anthem to thank her fatherland for all that was good and beautiful in the last 36 years. It is like a funeral. So that is, the roller coaster that people experienced within 12 months.
So we have a question here, and I think it's a good way to conclude our discussion on the unification before we go to some other topics. But is there a German identity now? How did integration into the EU affect German identity?
Well, I mean, the EU is very popular. So unlike in Britain, where you had Brexit, EU is very popular. Many Germans see themselves as Europeans. And in fact, if you ask people of a certain generation, what are you? You will get as an answer, oh, I'm a European. And then you have to press it. No, I mean, which country do you come from? people rather say they're European than they're German. But when it comes to East and West Germany, the interesting thing is we now have, 34 years since reunification. And if you just look at the hard facts, so the economic transformation, employment patterns, longevity and health, you can say, wonderful, lots of things have been accomplished, and it's a democratic place rather than a dictatorship. But psychologically and emotionally, the gulf in identity is probably as large as it was in 1989, 1990. So there's tremendous frustration. The best-selling, #1 best-selling book in Germany, nonfiction, for many, many months was a book by an East German author who over 200 pages just writes about the discrimination, stigmatization, and exclusion that East Germans face and have to overcome. And some writers even go as far and complain it to racism in the United States. So they're huge. There remains a huge gulf between the two sides, and you can see it in many. It comes out in many different ways, not least in the disproportionate support for populist groups. Also, you can see it in the much lower support for the help of Ukraine. So there is a genuine sense in East Germany, not by all East Germans, but by a very significant number and vocal number, that they've been robbed. So their hard work in the GDR, building up the country, was devalued because state property was privatized. That they still have, when it comes to wealth, fewer assets. So fewer East Germans own property, for example.
Yeah, what was that percentage? I have it somewhere in my notes. It was quite high, the difference. And that one of them was in Europe.
Yeah, well, Germany as a whole has the lowest home ownership in Europe. It's under 50%. So most people rent housing. But the people who are better off will have real estate or shares. And very, very few people in East Germany have that because, if they inherited something, it was worth nothing in East German times. So they've never had the time to build it up. So there's a real sense of being marginalized, not listened to by media and by politicians. And there's some basis to that. So as everyone knows, Chancellor Kohl was hugely successful at the polls. So the Western parties always won massively at the national elections, but the Western parties never put down roots in the neighborhoods in East Germany. It's a political...
So you really see a difference in the party structure between the two parts of Germany.
Absolutely.
I wish we could stay on this subject, and it's because there's so many things that I'd like to touch upon. And one of those is migration, because you mentioned Chancellor Kohl, and all of us remember Chancellor Merkel and her, what I considered at that time a very courageous stance on migration. We're showing here two pictures, one of young Turkish men, I think in the 1960s, that were recruited to come to Germany because Germany was facing a labor shortage. And then another photo, of course, of the chancellor with the president of Turkey. And again, we only have about 15 minutes left, but I wonder if you might help us understand how Germany has been so impacted by immigrants, needed them, and yet it is also a cause for some of the most serious political opposition and protests that you could imagine, and responsible for the growth of the ADF party.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the autumn of 2015 when Merkel became world famous with her so-called welcome culture. The only country in Europe to let in almost 1 million of refugees in that 1 year alone. And that was when I started the book, because the interesting thing that struck me was how Germany not just decided this, but how they talked about it. So you had leading politicians in parliament saying that Germany was now world champion of human sympathy through this refugee treatment. And the treatment of refugees was seen as a sign that Germany had overcome this negative self-image of the Second World War and had really turned a corner. So I became interested in this. If you roll back, and you had the picture there from probably late 60s, I would think, the interesting thing about Germany is that it continues to be actually conflicted over migration, because it is conflicted over what it means to be German. So in the 60s, huge labor shortage. You have several million initially Yugoslavian, Italian, Greek, and then mainly Turkish work migrants. Not all of them stayed. Many just returned. But many stayed and started to bring their families, and German society was in denial. The official line was Germany is not a migrant society. These are people who will return. There was no plan on opening schools because why would children want to learn German? Ultimately, they would go back. And this was clearly not the case. And it took that in the 70s and 80s, you had deep conflicts over should Germany be a multicultural society, or should people integrate and become new kinds of Germans. You had no German citizenship open to those migrant groups. So they were, politically speaking, non-citizens. They had the right to stay, but not the right to vote. They were marginalized and discriminated in the labor market, in the housing market, always the worst, most expensive flats, the most dangerous jobs, lowest performance level in schools. And this went on and on and on. And then only in 2000, you finally had citizenship reform. But by that time, which liberalized citizenship and made it possible under certain conditions, if you'd stayed long enough to become a German citizen. But by that time, you had, in many cities, you had parallel societies. So the damage had been done. Then more recently, under Merkel, the welcome to refugees was 2 years later already, was followed by a tough stance on deportations, which created sort of first-class and second-class refugees, some of them excluded from the labor market and being discriminated in multiple ways. So this tug of war between we should be a tolerant society on the one hand, and on the other hand, no, we're being overwhelmed here by foreigners. They don't fit in. These young people commit crimes and they rape our women. And
we had that horrible situation in Cologne.
That's right. That's right. So you have it's a bit like a yo-yo, the German attitude towards migration, and you see it in the last year, where you would think after 2015, 2016, when Germany had to deal with many hundreds of thousands of refugees, that the state would have woken up and said, okay, we need some kind of infrastructure. We can't just expect villages and towns and volunteers to just deal with this situation. But no, you didn't. So when the Ukrainian refugees arrived, even the best intentioned volunteer and civic initiatives soon really felt completely outstripped and overwhelmed and said, we can't, this is impossible, it's unrealistic. We must somehow get a control of the situation. And that fed into the populist xenophobia and demands that there should be restrictions on migration and a kind of Germany for ethnic Germans.
So how strong is the AfD party then? Because it seemed like they were growing and have a higher percentage. I forgot what it is, but it's quite significant.
Yeah.
And yet there were those massive protests against them throughout the country at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, the one doesn't exclude the other. You have both things going on. So in the eastern states, where there will be elections at the state level in autumn, the Alternative for Germany is polling between 30 and 35% of the vote. So, which is very important, because if you have more than 30%, it gives you a variety of rights in the state parliaments to select judges or block policies and things like that. On the other hand, you have these mass demonstrations, but the problem seems to be that the mass demonstrations haven't really eaten into the core of supporters for the AfD. So you have now there are some fascists, but the bigger problem, and numerical problem, is the large number of protest voters who feel they're not being listened to by the mainstream parties, who feel ignored, who worry about inequality or uncertainty in the world, war, and all these things, and who've decided they're just going to vote for, they just use their vote as a form of protest, regardless of the fascist elements in the AfD. So the real challenge is not, or let's put it this way, the real issue is not to get people out demonstrating against extreme far-right parties. That's one thing. I think the more difficult challenge is to win back the millions of people who've become disillusioned and who are toying with voting for these populists.
So, when you look at now the current Chancellor, Schulz, it must make President Biden happy, because Schulz's disapproval rating is 73% compared to President Biden's, which I think is right now around 54% in the article that I picked up from the New York Times. Why is he so unpopular?
He is probably, it's very unfortunate for him. There different times call for different leaders. When he was elected, it's before Gaza, it's before the Hamas attacks, and before the Russian attack on Ukraine. He inherited the mantle from Merkel. He had been finance minister under Merkel, and his main line was, "I'm dull. You know what you get, but I'm competent. I will deal with money, and you can count on me." But he's uncharismatic. He's wavering. So he's unwilling to pursue a visionary line. And he's failed. It's a coalition government between Social Democrats, Greens, and economic liberals. And the minute things got tough, these three elements started wrangling and wrestling with each other. And he's failed to really impose a clear line and control. So I think that's the main reason. The bigger historical context is that he inherited Merkel's line, which is, don't worry, if you vote for me, I will make sure you don't have, your life will be comfortable, stable, and secure. So for many, many years, the German population has been coddled in this illusion that they can have a nice life, the economy will be booming, they can have their cars, and there will be peace, and so forth. And of course, as you know, we've had now multiple crises intersecting with each other. And what's really needed is a leader who stands up and says, look, there are things worth fighting for, and we all need to make sacrifices.
Well, as we get closer to the end of the program, unfortunately, I have a question here from Robert. Do the Germans view Russia as a threat or an ally? And I'm going to ask you to respond to that in 30 seconds.
Well, it's 60-40. 60% see him as a threat, and 40% think, what's wrong with tying Putin to us and just taking his cheap gas and oil again? It's a popular position in the eastern part, unfortunately.
One of the things you did in the book, and it refers a lot to, I think you might say, German population desire to be better, to succeed, and to put forth the most positive face. And one of the ways is how they treat seniors. And I wonder if it is, as well as the high percentage of people who volunteer.
Yes.
And I wonder if you might talk about that.
Yeah, it's one of the many contradictory features that makes up Germany. On the one hand, very high moral, good, idealistic intentions, which is in the social system. Children are expected to look after and pay for their elderly parents, not the state. It's the family which should look after itself in the first place. But the reality, of course, is that most of that falls on the shoulders of wives and daughters who do most of the caring. And it's a demographic time bomb, because there's been very few children, a seriously aging population. I think it's one of the most dramatically aging populations in Europe. So in a few years, over a third of Germans will be pensioners. And you have a shortage of staff in hospitals and care homes, and this anti-migration attitude. So it's completely unclear how German society will come true in really looking after people who will be elderly and in need, because the young generation is shrinking, and more women are saying, look, what about equality here? Why are we expected to stop work in our career?
And Frank, people are going to have to read your book to learn more about that. I found where you talked about how children are obligated in many cases to take care of their parents of interest. I was tempted to forward that to my own children to remind them. But I'm sorry that our conversation has to end now. But again, congratulations on the book. It is really worth reading. And as I said, one of the reasons I was eager to have this discussion and read the book is I was unfamiliar with a lot of the history that you brought up, and you've done it so well, especially, I would add, drawing on the archives and some of the letters that people read. Again, let me thank all of our partners for being part of this program, especially the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and Global Santa Fe, and all of our friends across the country have joined us today. Look forward to seeing you on May 2nd, when I'll be talking with Sarah Schulz, a science journalist who's written an important book that, listen to this, has been reviewed favorably in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and just this past week in The Economist. So I hope to see you then, and you can register through any of our sponsors. Again, thanks for being with us. Have a good day.